So, JB, it always interests me, like, how people get into this story. And I guess for me, it was really when I came across Rubiel Holt's Treasure Hunting the Northwest at Goodwill. I think it was maybe like $2 or something like that. It might have even had the 50% off tag. But I was like, what a good story. Just kind of looking through it in the aisle there, and ended up picking it up, and I just devoured this book. So I think this book here is really what got me started in this story. How about you, JB? What got you started in the Neahkahnie treasure?
Yeah, I think it was probably, I did a talk back in like 2014 about the Neahkahnie treasure hunters, and I started getting really fascinated in them. And part of it was that really hit on my interest in ghosts, not like supernatural ghosts, but like historical ghosts, like people who just leave kind of a faint blip on the historical radar. And it's like, when I learned about Ed Fire and what he was doing on Neahkahnie Mountain, I was just like, I need to find out more about who this guy was. Because what he said he found up there was just like phenomenal. And I just really wanted to figure out more about who that was.
And you and I, of course, we've been looking into this story for years. We've walked this land. We've gone up the mountain. We've walked along the side. We've gone to Bill's Rock. Like, how important do you think it is to take a look at Smuggler's Cove and that kind of thing, to really kind of understand this story and the topography involved? How important is that?
I think it's huge. We've talked about how, because we've gone all up and down the coast, and in places like Astoria, it just doesn't have that mystique that a place like Smuggler's Cove, even the name, or the Devil's Cauldron. There's such fascinating geological, kind of topographical places that create this sort of imaginative realm, right, where you can just get caught up in the sort of what if. And I think that's a huge part of it. You go down that rugged coastline, and it's hard not to wonder about something, whether it's Manila Galleons, whether it's about buried treasure. It just seems like that's going to be there.
Of course, you drive around Manzanita and you have, Treasure Lane, and you have Beeswax Drive and that kind of thing. So, like, these names are kind of ingrained, and the story is really ingrained. This story goes back to longer than Oregon itself as a political entity, right?
Absolutely.
This story goes back over 300 years.
Absolutely, and the Beeswax is really a huge part of it, right? That name, maybe more than any in this town, is like what could really, you could say, be pointed to as the kind of, not just origin, but the kind of generator of all this possibility, right? So, yeah.
And there's so much of it. As we've done our historical research on this project, we decided to go to every historical society or museum that had a piece of beeswax, and we actually couldn't do it. There was like too many. It's so rare, but it's almost kind of ubiquitous as well within these archives and collections. So why is there so much beeswax around Oregon?
Well, so, for a little while, people thought it was mineral wax, right? They were digging it up and thinking this has to be naturally occurring, because there were, tons, like literally tons of wax, right, that were being found. And then pretty much it became much more widely kind of agreed upon that it wasn't mineral wax. It wasn't naturally occurring. It was actually from a ship, right? And part of that is because it has all these markings that are shippers marks, right? And those marks really tell a story, which is that this stuff all came off of a shipwreck, or maybe multiple wrecks. But these ships, especially the Manila Galleons, would have been carrying literally tons of beeswax, right?
90, 100 tons,
yeah.
80 tons. It's so that kind of magnitude,
exactly.
Right?
And if that wrecks and washes ashore, that's going to kind of spread all over the place.
We have records of Lewis and Clark talking about wanting to get some of the bear's wax. We've speculated maybe the beeswax, as Ordway wrote. Mm-hmm. So again, this wax goes back into the historical record. And when we were in the archives in Philomath, we saw documentation of people actually going up to a wreck on the Halem Spit in the 1890s and pulling pieces of teakwood off, pulling a piece of tackle off, pulling some beeswax off of the shipwreck that was still visible at that time. So this isn't really kind of ancient history stuff. No. This is stretching back there not too far.
Yeah, it's true. And, I think if we could go back to the bear's wax for just a minute, because I think that is also something we need to kind of pause on, kind of along these lines, which is that is oftentimes presented as a mistake, that he's called it bear's wax and he was getting beeswax wrong. But I think there are two ways to look at that. One, you mentioned about bears, right? About actual bear fat.
Bear fat and bear wax. A lot of the Chinook people would actually cover their bodies with that fat. It would keep the bugs from biting them, and it was actually keep them warm as they're kind of in and out of the waters here in the rivers.
Right. So it might be a descriptor along those lines, right? That was actually called beeswax. And another one, which is interesting, it also kind of attests to going back really far, is accounts of among indigenous peoples of Europeans coming, these bearded guys that they would, in some cases, describe as like bears. So the idea that also bear's wax could be knowingly describing this is wax from this ship.
Why was the wax coming across on the Manila Galleon?
Yeah, well, on those galleons, these big cargo ships, basically, right? I mean, these were, in all fairness, they were transporter ships. But the thing is, they were really the first to be doing that, right? These super dangerous, super high stakes, long journeys that would happen traveling between the Philippines and Acapulco, Mexico, right? And these annual voyages involve bringing all kinds of goods to trade at the Acapulco market from Manila, right, from the Philippines, which included all kinds of things, right? Beeswax would be important, especially for candles in churches throughout New Spain, right, where there were basically rules that you had to be burning beeswax in certain spaces, in sacred spaces. It couldn't be fat, it couldn't be other kinds of wax. So you had that. And by the way, we know that it is beeswax because it's been tested to come from Asian honeybees, right? So that whole conversation is really, really close. But then as far as other things that were coming, we know silks. Silks were probably the most valuable object that was coming over as far as just the sheer luxury good that silks were at that time. Cotton, other kinds of textiles, porcelain, right? Lots of porcelain.
Then this is porcelain specifically for the European market,
Exactly.
as opposed to porcelain made by the Chinese for the Chinese market.
Exactly, right. And you have also the fact that this porcelain was coming from China along with lots of other goods that basically in Manila, this was kind of a place that a lot of Chinese craftspeople, tradespeople were coming to bring these goods to then benefit from that market in Acapulco, right? And part of that too, of course, is that a lot of this has to do with silver, right? That you have all these goods being brought over, and what are we getting in return? Well, all the silver is coming back from Peru and from other places, but especially from Peru in valuable silver mines, right? Which were then coming back to basically help build China, right? To really build China's wealth by way of all of that money coming back from these trips, and they were very profitable, right? But the trip that they were making, up around the Sea of Japan, and then across this really pretty dangerous exposed Pacific crossing, and then pretty much to about Monterey Peninsula, California, before they start to head down south. So when we're talking about Northwest Oregon, we're talking about a journey that they, first of all, weren't supposed to make, right? Because the winds and the currents wouldn't really get them there unless there was a really big storm, middle of winter, really rough conditions, or something went wrong with the equipment, right? Something happened on the ship that couldn't be fixed. But even then, the question of how long would that take to get up to this area, right? A couple days maybe? Is that...
And again, these ships had 20, 30 carpenters on board. So if there is some sort of a structural integrity of the ship, I'm assuming they can take care of most of that. If there's disease or something like that, we have accounts from native legends of actually survivors from the shipwreck coming aboard, coming ashore and so on. So again, when we look at this Manila Galleon situation, it seems like we are so far north that there isn't a reason for that ship to be here, but we have a lot of archaeological evidence that kind of indicates that there might indeed have been one of these galleons around.
Yeah, and I think it's hard at this point not to say there probably was a Manila Galleon versus, say, like a Chinese junk. The Manila Galleon, certainly with the porcelain, certainly with the wax and with the shippers' marks that have been matched to some known shippers in the Manila Galleon trade, even though fewer than you would hope have been matched. But still, it seems to be the Manila Galleon. But then that question comes up of which one, and is it one ship? And when we get into talking about the treasure, are we talking about all of this being one incident or separate incidents, right? There's a lot of moving parts. One of the things about the story that I find so fascinating is we have this whole heritage of saying it was one in particular, right? A ship.
San Francisco Javier.
Exactly, right? 1705, it comes across, it wrecks, it's never seen or heard from again, it's missing. Pretty safe bet, right? But then increasingly, it's all about the Santo Cristo de Burgos, right?
Maybe in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, right?
Exactly.
As maybe since the publication of this fantastic special edition, Oregon's Manila Galleon.
Yeah, yeah. I think that was probably about when you really see that starting to shift.
So tell us about the Burgos.
Yeah, the Santo Cristo de Burgos. So with that one, and I think we're talking just in the last few years, this has become a real candidate. We're talking the mid-1690s here, and what we're looking at is basically a ship that had trouble heading out. With the previous contender, the San Francisco Javier, 1705, for a long time people believed it was that. That ship just simply went missing. The Burgos had trouble. It had to turn around the year before, and then sailed again on its fateful journey where it disappeared. So basically, the archaeologists and historians who've really settled on that are going with just some really interesting evidence, right?
Because we do have some kind of shards in the historical record indicating that the Burgos actually burned, correct?
That's right, yeah. The person who actually was the sort of shipmaster in the Philippines for the construction of these Manila Galleons in the late 17th century reported that the Burgos had burned in the Mariana Islands, and that pieces of the ship, not just like random burnt timbers, but actual planks from the ship were identified and found and recovered a couple of years after it went missing. But the interesting thing is most historians and archaeologists at this point sort of debunk that and usually say it probably is the Burgos. And the reason they do that in part has to do with the beeswax and where it was found, and the pottery sherds as well, which is
a sherd?
Shard. You know, historians and archaeologists go with sherd. Most of us go with shard, but you know what we're talking about. Yeah, like little fragments of pottery, right? So these things were washing up, both along with the beeswax, and we established these have been widely found over the years, including even now you can find pottery.
As we have several times.
Exactly. But where they were found, or where they're found, is really, for a long time, was a big mystery. Washed well above the tidal zone, right? And sometimes deep in the ground, like a couple feet, sometimes even more below the surface. And so a lot of people that would, for a long time, figure this has to be naturally occurring wax, because why would it be underground? Well, the answer to that is the 1700 subduction earthquake and the following the tsunami that ensued, right? Because the reality was that event washed all of that material much further up. And so basically that rules out the San Francisco Javier for a lot of people. They say, well, it couldn't be 1705 because the earthquake hadn't happened yet. But we don't really know for sure because we still have the idea that it burned, right?
Right.
And we still have these other ships, earlier ships that went missing in the 16th century.
The San Antonio.
San Antonio.
Another example of one.
Yeah. And it should be pointed out just real quickly that lots of ships, lots of the Manila Galleons over this 200 plus year period had problems, wrecked, got captured, right? But only 4 ships in that whole time actually disappeared, actually were completely lost without a trace, or at least in the case of the Burgos, maybe burning, but still, for the most part, missing.
So JB, tell us about the treasure rocks. I have an example of one here. You can see 1632 in the triangle, maybe like a mountain. You can see a W that's pretty prominently marked as an arrow. Tell us about these treasure rocks, if you will.
Yeah, so this is a big part of all of the interest in the region for treasure, which was basically in the 1860s, and we don't know, it could have been earlier, but in the 1860s is when a major discovery happened. A settler named Will Snyder hit upon one of these rocks with his plow. And then pretty quickly in the ensuing decade or so, other people started finding other so-called treasure rocks. And these rocks really fuel the imagination, right? Because they have these mysterious marks, and people have actually followed them to other rocks and other items based on their interpretation. So oftentimes the response to this is, well, they're probably a survey marker of some sort, or they're fake, or they're a tourist attraction, because it turned out for a long time they were set in front of the Manzanita real estate office or a real estate office to help basically get people excited about coming to this area. Right? But at the end of the day, there does seem to be something about these rocks that really goes along with the other kinds of energies that motivated these treasure seekers, well beyond just kind of like a basic hunch, right? They really interpreted these things.
And you look at when these were found, I mean, 1840s, there weren't a lot of white settlers out here during that time period. That's very early on in terms of settling Oregon Territory. So to see these kind of, these Latin letters here, we see DE, we say BKS on other ones. I mean, this is obviously done by, European folks, at the earliest, just a few years before the settlers were coming out. And if you look further, I mean, it's possible that they could have gone back even further, correct?
Right,
even maybe back to Drake.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up Drake, because his name really should come into this. Sir Francis Drake, we're talking about the 16th century here. When he circumnavigated the world, we know that he came up the Pacific coast in 1579. And of course, there's lots of debate about, where this Fair and Good Bay that he fixed his ship, the Golden Hind, was, San Francisco Bay, Oregon, right? Lots of back and forth on that. But the bottom line that I'm really fascinated with is, and I think you are too, the question of, okay, if he was here and he did survey, which a lot of people believe, what was he surveying for? And I think that's where we still get back to that treasure question, right? Because even there, something of value brought him here. It may have been navigation related, but more likely than not, it had something to do with the fact that England was really scrambling to try to get its foot in the door of the game of global expansion and trade. And really, England was trying everything it could to find a place that it could establish. So was Drake surveying for future colony? Maybe. We don't know that. But even there's room for that idea of, okay, is that some sort of a treasure marker of some kind, right? Or was he hiding things here? Who knows? Yeah, well, let's talk about those oral traditions, because that is a big part of this too, right? Is we have actual witness accounts that basically help to explain at least a piece of this, which is there was some kind of boat or some kinds of ships wrecking and encounters between indigenous people and survivors washing up. And that part of it has carried over from important oral accounts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The native people in those areas have oral traditions about some ships engaged in some sort of combat, and some members of those ships' parties coming ashore, oftentimes bearing some chests or something like that, and then actually intermingling with the native populations for some time. And that isn't unique to this area around Neahkahnie Mountain. We know of Jack Ramsay, who was the gentleman that Lewis and Clark first encountered, and then he was written about 20 years later, whose father was most likely a British sailor who was involved in the shipwreck. We know that people up north, the Quinaults and so on, they captured Russians and so on. So the three Kishis we talked about before. So there absolutely were incidents where people would shipwreck on the shores. They would survive. They would become integrated with the native populations. So we do have an oral tradition, that supports the idea of a ship with a chest bearing it, and then those survivors came ashore. We don't know entirely what happened to them, but that would seem to be supported. Now, is that a treasure-carrying ship? Is it the Beeswax ship? That we don't know.
Would it be fair to, regardless of whether we can really parse that out, to say, though, that if we're going on those oral traditions that basically say these are eyewitness accounts that something happened, that it's also important to say, well, for the subsequent accounts and interpretations by settlers who encountered these traditions, we should also hear them out in terms of what they were doing, which was basically taking those accounts very literally, one could say, to suggest, okay, yes, there are chests buried. We're going to go look for treasure. Should we take those seriously as well?
Yeah, I think we absolutely should. It is all part of the record. It is all part of the evidence that we consider when we look at the record. And we take a look at, a piece of caulking that looks like it's mango fibers, that is in an archive in Philomath. We also take into account, settlers' interpretations of oral traditions from the 1830s, which is when those really kind of began showing up, around us. We have times where people have speculated that the Astor Party, that members went down to this area and maybe purchased chests that were full of doubloons or other golden items. We don't have a lot to back that up, but it's interesting that kind of as the original American Europeans were coming to this area in 1811, the stories of this treasure get intermingled with them from the moment of arrival. I find that to be very fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.